Thank you very much, and thank you for the Belgrade Forum for this invitation, which gives me the first opportunity not only to come to Belgrade, but even to Serbia or to the entire so-called former Yugoslavia, which I'd never been before. So as you see, I don't have any strong connection to your country, except that it is in 1999, with the beginning of the Kosovo War, that I got involved in peace activities. I had no particular knowledge of Yugoslavia, and I still don't pretend to have any knowledge, certainly not respect to you, and I don't want to take side in the internal conflict in Yugoslavia, but I was very much opposed to the way NATO and the United States exploited the conflict in order to intervene in it. And I was mostly struck by the fact that when the war exploded, it was extremely popular, mostly on the left, and mostly among Greens, for example, the Greens or the ecologists, that started out as a radical peace organization, and they were extremely favorable to so-called humanitarian intervention. And it's by thinking about humanitarian intervention that I started to get involved in every further war, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Ukraine, and also the Colored Revolution, the threats against Venezuela, etc. And that's why I wrote a book, actually, which is called Humanitarian Imperialism, Using Human Rights to Sell War, which was translated by our friend Diana Johnstone into English. And so it's a reflection which I would like to share about what's happening in the West. I know you are all familiar with the issues in Yugoslavia, so I don't have to tell you anything about that. But you see, it's striking the sort of thinking or lack of thinking that exists now. And if we want to build a world of equals, we need to know who is for and who is against, and who are the forces in the West who are against. I don't think it's everybody, but it's everybody that can be seen in the mainstream media or in the political class. That's true. I don't think it's the entire population, not by any means. But it's an important sector of opinion makers, etc. And I see two currents, basically, who are for this militarization and intervention. One are the neoconservatives, who are very strong in the United States. And of course, their trick is pretty easy. These guys want to protect Israel. That's their main target. But they want to use military power of the United States to so-called protect Israel, for example, to attack Iran. But of course, they don't say it like that because it wouldn't work. So they praise the power of the United States, and they say to the Americans, you are big, you are strong, you are good, and you should run the world, etc. But in reality, it's all for Israel in practice. But then the other current which I want to think about is the humanitarian, what I call the humanitarian imperialist left, or the human rights left, who has accepted this discourse of intervention. I think it's relevant probably to Sweden, because I was also in Sweden once, and I realized that the change in Sweden is mostly due to this ideology of humanitarian intervention, right to intervene, duty to intervene, which has basically swept the entire West ways of thinking. And you see, that's of course a big problem in our thinking. So I want to, there's basically nothing left of people who are opposed to imperialism. You see, with the collapse of communism, what happened is that people had to find a holy cause. It wouldn't be socialism anymore, whatever you mean by that word. It became human rights, democracy. People accepted the free market at the economic level. There was nothing to be done at the economic level. They thought it's a law of nature. So they took as a goal to propagate human rights, defend human rights, and democracy and so on. And that, as I say, the old social democrats, for example, there were tendencies in the old social democracy that were against the war. The Swedish, for example, the Swedes, for example, and others. But this has totally disappeared. The Greens, who started as radical pacifists, they wouldn't defend themselves militarily even under attack. Now they're all for sending troops all over the world. In Germany, they are the worst. They are more critical of Russia than Merkel, for example. They're critical of... So, the communists first of all, they don't exist very much in our countries anymore, but they've changed also. When you talk to them, they're also swept by that. The far left is like that. The Trotskys are even more for intervention than the others. So there's really nothing left of the anti-war movement. You see, so there are several, but I want to list a few problems that are met by this ideology. The first thing is that if you want to intervene or you want to make sanctions and so on, you have to do it militarily, okay? And who has the military means to intervene? It costs a fortune to do that. When there was the Libyan war, the US decided to go along, and then France can pretend that it went along. But when the US decided not to wage war on Syria, France, who was totally gung-ho for the war, Hollande was totally for the war, and there was no opposition, unlike in the US and in Britain. They didn't go to war because they didn't have the means. So in fact, what the message of the pro-intervention European to the Americans is, oh, Americans, please make war, not love. I mean, that's really what we are saying to the Americans, because we are not able to wage war on our own, and we want just to be ideological puppets, laquais, as one used to say in the good old days, laquais of US imperialism. But you see, and in fact, since the Americans aren't going to send troops anymore, all we're asking is to bomb, like they did in Kosovo, you see. That's one way. The other thing is that the political and military class that is supposed to save population killed by their dictators, as they keep on saying, is the same that waged the Vietnam War, that imposed sanctions and wars on Iraq, that imposes arbitrary sanctions on Cuba, Iran, and many other countries, that massively supports Israel, uses every means, including coup d'etat, to oppose social reformers like Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, Goulart in Brazil in 1965, Allende in Chile in 1973, Lumumba in the Congo, Mossadegh in Iran, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, or Chavez in Venezuela. One must be ready starry-eyed to see in that political and military class the instrument of salvation of the victim. But that is in practice exactly what the pro-intervention left is saying, because given the relationship of the force in the world, there is no other military force than the United States which is able to impose its will. But that's not all. Every aggressive action by the United States creates a reaction. Deployment of an anti-missile shield produces more missiles, not less. Bombing civilians produces more armed resistance, not less. Trying to overthrow or subvert government produces more internal repression, not less. Encouraging secessionist minorities by giving them the impression that the sole superpower will come to their rescue in case they are repressed leads to more violence, hatred, and death, not less. The possession of nuclear weapons by Israel encourages other states of the Middle East to acquire such weapons. The humanitarian disaster in eastern Congo as well as in Somalia are mainly due to foreign intervention, not to a lack of them. To take the most extreme case, which is a favorite example of horror cited by advocates of intervention, it is most unlikely that the Khmer Rouge would have ever taken power in Cambodia without the massive secret US bombing followed by US engineered regime change that left that unfortunate country totally disrupted and destabilized. Defenders of intervention often refer to the international community as the agents of interventions, giving it a universalist appearance. But in reality, there is no such thing as a genuine international community. NATO's intervention in Kosovo was not approved by Russia, and Russian intervention in South Ossetia and Crimea was condemned by the West. Any system of international justice or police, whether it's a responsibility to protect or the International Criminal Court, needs a relationship of equality and a climate of trust. Today, there is no equality and there is no trust between the West and the East, between the North and the South, largely as a result of past US policies. If we want a version of responsibility to protect, which I'm not in principle against, to work in the future, we need first to build a relationship of equality and trust. And what I just said about here goes to the heart of the matter. The world can become more secure only if it first becomes more just. The promoters of intervention present it as the beginning of a new era. But in fact, it's the end of an old one. Humanitarian intervention is a step back relative to traditional colonialism. What people forget is that the main social movement of the 20th century was decolonization. It was not fascism or communism, as usually taught in the West. For the rest of the world was decolonization, and decolonization continues today through the affirmation of a multiple world. And I don't think the United States or anybody else has the forces to oppose it, except in some victories like the coup in Ukraine, which are, I think, short run, or the bombing of Yugoslavia, which I think are short run on the side of history. Now, coming back to the West, you see, what I find dramatic as a Westerner is the absolute closeness of the Western mind. I remember the Cold War, but during the Cold War, because of the existence of a communist movement, there was at least, how can I say, people knew that there was somebody else thinking differently somewhere in the world, because there were communist countries and there were communist movements, etc. So you had at least an awareness of another point of view. Now it seems to me that there is no awareness whatsoever. Take, for example, Libya. I mean, there was an article in Le Monde, you see, but the article in Le Monde describes a country totally disintegrating and with civil war everywhere, etc. And they say, can't we be indifferent to a situation that we contribute, to which we contributed a little bit to create, just a little bit? I mean, months of bombardment. I mean, of course, they aren't going to fix the situation, because it's one thing to overthrow a government by bombing its army, another to go to a country and establish peace. I mean, that requires massive effort that they're never going to do. So, of course, but you see, they don't realize that, they say, of course, we're not criticizing the intervention. Or take Syria. When there was the use of gases in the Ghouta in August 2013, last year, there was massive accusation against the Syrian government. It was obvious that they were guilty. The Human Rights Watch, the New York Times, they were all there. All the gang was there accusing the Syrian government. I didn't believe a word of it, because why would they use these weapons just when inspectors go to their country? I mean, it didn't make any sense. Okay? And now there is a report from the MIT, a scientific report based on the laws of physics. I'm a physicist, I'm not an expert in that, but I believe in the laws of physics. And, which shows that it couldn't possibly come from the area controlled by the government. You think they change their mind? You think they become critical of the report about Ukraine or about Russia? Not at all. Not at all. They are gung-ho like before with their propaganda. I mean, this is a disaster. But I think there is a lot of opposition, growing opposition in the population themselves. For example, Le Figaro, the French newspaper, was complaining that on their website, when you look at the readers' comments, which are nevertheless filtered and censored, nevertheless, most of them are favorable to Putin and Russia. So, in fact, and you see similar trends in the United States, polls are massively against intervention in Ukraine. And there was massive opposition to intervention in Syria. So the tide is changing. But I predict that this humanitarian left is going to suffer the same way I think the communist left suffers from being too reliant on whatever the USSR was doing. The humanitarian left is going to suffer a lot for having thrown its lot in reality with US imperialism. And the opposition movement usually come from the right. They come from the libertarian or paleo-classical right in the United States, even from the National Front in France, I mean, or so-called populist movement elsewhere, in Italy, for example. But I think they are going to suffer a lot from that, but that's their fault. I told them so before. I think that, slowly the world is changing. Whether we are completely happy about it or not, I don't know. But nevertheless, you must realize that there are millions of people in the West who are, if not exactly on the same wavelength as you, are increasingly opposed to this policy of interference and domination. Even though you can't see their voice, if you read the media, they're slandered, they're called anti-American, anti-Semitic, and so on, they're called names, but our voice is more and more heard, and I thank you for having invited me here. Thank you.